They told me it was just dinner. My aunt texted me on a Tuesday afternoon, the message so short it barely qualified as communication. "We're all getting together Saturday, come, it'll be good for the family." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement of the 3 years of silence. Just an address, a time, and the quiet assumption that I would show up, because that's what people in this family do. They show up, they swallow whatever they're feeling, and they sit down at the table and they smile. I almost didn't go. I was sitting in my apartment in Columbus, surrounded by the evidence of a life I had quietly built without any of them knowing, the framed patent on the wall, the incorporation documents on my desk, the laptop open to a quarterly report that would have made their jaws drop, and I thought, what is the point? But something made me go. I think part of me wanted to believe that 3 years was long enough, that people could change, that maybe my aunt's text, as cold as it was, meant someone was ready to extend an olive branch. I should have trusted my instincts. My name is Lacey and I'm 31 years old. When I was 22, I graduated with a degree in chemical engineering from Ohio State and took a job at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company in Columbus as a junior lab technician. The salary was decent for a new grad, not impressive. My family made sure I knew that. My cousin Vincent had gone into real estate right out of high school, and by 25 he was driving a BMW and talking at every family gathering about square footage and cap rates and his guy at the country club. My Aunt Sandra, his mother, had a habit of steering every conversation back to Vincent. How well Vincent was doing. What a smart boy Vincent was. How Vincent knew how to hustle. Unlike some people who spent 4 years studying something nobody can even explain at Thanksgiving, that last one was directed at me. I remember it clearly, because I was holding a paper plate with a drumstick on it, and I didn't say anything, just nodded and went back for more stuffing. My Uncle Dale wasn't much better. He thought engineers were people who drove trains. When I tried to explain what I actually did, developing formulations for drug delivery systems, he said, "So you work in a factory?" and went back to his phone. My mother had passed away when I was 19. She was the only one in that family who ever looked at me like I was worth something. After she was gone, I was tolerated. There's no kinder word for it. I showed up to holidays, I brought wine or a casserole. I listened to Vincent's real estate updates and my aunt's commentary on my life choices, and I drove home alone feeling about 2 inches tall. When I was 26, something shifted. I had been working on a side project for almost a year, a method for improving the stability of a particular class of compounds in extended-release capsules. I was doing it in my own time, on my own dime, in a rented lab space I shared with 2 other independent researchers. I filed a provisional patent application on a Thursday. By the following spring, I had a full patent. By the time I was 27, I had licensed the technology to 3 different pharmaceutical manufacturers and quit my job. I started a company. Just me and a business attorney and a very good accountant, operating out of a converted Victorian in German village that I bought and renovated into office space. I brought on a small team, 6 people at first, then 12, then more. We developed specialty pharmaceutical formulations for companies that didn't have the internal R&D capacity to do it themselves. By the time I was 30, I was comfortable in a way that I had no interest in explaining to anyone in my family. I had moved out of my apartment into a house in Bexley. I bought a sensible car, nothing flashy. I wore the same jeans and flannel shirts I'd always worn. The only difference was that when I looked at my bank account, I didn't feel afraid anymore. I hadn't told any of them. Not my aunt, not my uncle, not Vincent. The last time I'd seen them was 3 years ago at my cousin Angela's baby shower, where my aunt had pulled me aside to ask, with genuine concern in her voice, whether I was still doing okay financially. I told her I was fine. She patted my hand like I was terminal. 3 days after that shower, I stopped returning their calls. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was just a quiet closing of a door. So when the text came on that Tuesday, I stared at it for a long time. I went. The restaurant was a steakhouse in Dublin, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and leather booths and a wine list in a leather binder. The valet line had 3 Range Rovers in it. I pulled in behind them in my 2019 Subaru Outback and handed my keys to a kid in a red vest. I walked inside and gave my aunt's name to the hostess, and she smiled and said, "Of course. The rest of your party is already seated." That sentence landed a little wrong. The rest of your party. I thought it was going to be a small dinner, my aunt and uncle, maybe Vincent, maybe Angela and her husband. The hostess led me through the main dining room and into a private room in the back. There were 14 people sitting around a large rectangular table. I stood in the doorway for a moment and just looked. My Aunt Sandra was at the head, my Uncle Dale next to her, Vincent, his girlfriend Kelsey, his business partner whose name I could never remember, Angela and her husband, 3 of my uncle's brothers with their wives, a couple I didn't even recognize, and my cousin Marcus's college roommate apparently, who had been invited because he was basically family. They had already ordered appetizers. A platter of shrimp cocktail sat in the center of the table, bread baskets. Someone had a glass of red wine that looked expensive. My aunt stood up and opened her arms. "Lacey, you came!" She said it like it was a wonderful surprise, like she hadn't texted me 4 days ago and expected me to be here. I hugged her. I sat down in the open chair they'd left at the far end of the table, away from her, nearest to the door. A server came by and handed me a menu. I looked at it. Wagyu beef at market price, whole Maine lobster for $89, a tasting menu for $175 per person. The wine list had bottles starting at $90 and going up to, I actually had to look twice, $1,500. My uncle leaned across the table and said, "Order whatever you want. We're celebrating tonight." "What are we celebrating?" I asked. He smiled and pointed at Vincent, who was sitting back in his chair with the particular posture of a man who has rehearsed his own announcement. "Vincent just closed the biggest deal of his career," my uncle said. "Commercial property, up near Polaris. Kid made more on this one transaction than most people see in 5 years." Everyone clapped. Kelsey squeezed Vincent's arm. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. The dinner proceeded the way these things do, loud, overlapping conversations, the particular kind of noise that happens when people who love themselves gather in a room together. I mostly listened. I talked to Angela a little about her daughter. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, which was something. The orders went in. Vincent ordered the Wagyu, his business partner ordered the lobster. My uncle ordered a bone-in ribeye and a bottle of wine, not from the middle of the list, from somewhere near the top. My aunt ordered for the whole table at one point, adding 2 more appetizers and a charcuterie board without consulting anyone. I ordered the salmon, it was $38. I thought that was reasonable. The first bottle of wine disappeared quickly. A second was ordered, then a third. At some point someone ordered a round of cocktails I didn't ask for and didn't drink. The noise in the room had that loose, celebratory quality that comes after enough good wine. I was mostly quiet. I was thinking about a formulation problem one of my clients had raised that week, turning it over in my mind when my uncle cleared his throat. "So Lacey," he said, and the table got a degree quieter. "You still doing that lab stuff?" "I have my own company," I said. He nodded in the way that people nod when they're not really listening. Good, good. Staying busy. That's important." Vincent looked over. "You're still in Columbus? Same place?" "I moved a few years ago. I'm over in Bexley now." Something shifted on his face, just briefly. Bexley is not a cheap neighborhood, but he recovered quickly and went back to his wine. Dessert arrived, creme brulee, a chocolate torte, something with salted caramel. Nobody had asked if I wanted dessert. It was simply ordered and placed on the table and consumed. Then the server came in with the check. He set it at the end of the table near my uncle, which is where the natural authority of the table was. My uncle glanced at it and then, without missing a beat, picked it up and slid it down the table toward me. "We figured you'd handle this one," he said. He was smiling. I looked at the check. I looked at the number at the bottom, $4,312. That included tax. The tip line was still blank. I looked up. 14 people were looking at me with expressions ranging from casual expectation to barely concealed amusement. Vincent had a small smile on his face. Kelsey was looking at her phone. My aunt said, gently, "The way you'd explain something to a child. Vincent does so much for this family. And you've always been so independent, Lacey. We thought since you've been doing well at your little business, you could contribute. Just this once. It would mean a lot. Your little business." I held the check in both hands and thought about the last quarterly revenue report sitting on my desk at home. I thought about the 8 employees I had brought on in the last 2 years, the health insurance I paid for out of pocket, the research grants I had funded at 2 different universities. I thought about the provisional patent I was currently prosecuting for a delivery mechanism that 3 Fortune 500 companies had already expressed interest in licensing. I set the check back down on the table. "No," I said. There was a silence. My aunt blinked. "Excuse me?" I'm not paying for this dinner, I said. My voice was completely even. I had not realized how calm I was until I heard myself. I didn't order most of this food. I didn't choose this restaurant. I was told it was a family dinner. I ordered salmon, Lacey, my uncle said, and his voice had taken on the tone he used when he thought he was being patient with someone slow. Nobody's asking you to make a big deal of this. It's just dinner. It's for $300, I said. For a dinner I was invited to 3 days ago with no context and no discussion of who was paying. We just thought that I would pay because I'm doing okay. I looked at him. When did you figure that out? Because 3 years ago at Angela's shower, Sandra asked me if I was managing financially. My aunt opened her mouth, closed it. I've built something, I said. I've done it quietly and I've done it without any support from this family. And I have no problem contributing to things that matter. But I'm not going to pay $300 for a dinner celebrating Vincent at a restaurant I didn't choose, for food I didn't order, because it was assumed I would. Vincent set down his wine glass. Nobody was assuming anything. We just thought it would be a nice gesture. Vincent, I said, looking right at him. You just closed the biggest deal of your career. You told us that yourself an hour ago. Why aren't you picking up the check for your own celebration? The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. My uncle's brother started to say something about family responsibility. Angela caught my eye from across the table and I could tell from her face that she hadn't known about this arrangement. She looked mortified. I picked up my purse. I took out my wallet. I found the receipt from my own order. I had kept it when the server came by earlier, an old habit, and I calculated my portion plus tax plus a 20% tip on my items. I took out $58 in cash. I set it on the table next to my plate. That's my share, I said. The rest is between the 14 of you. I stood up. My chair made a sound against the floor. My aunt said my name in a warning tone that I had spent most of my life responding to. I kept walking. I retrieved my car from the valet. I sat in the driver's seat for about 45 seconds with the engine off, just breathing. Then I drove home. The text started before I got to the highway. Lacey, that was embarrassing. My aunt, you could have just paid it and been the bigger person. Vincent, I can't believe you did that in front of everyone. My uncle's brother, which surprised me because I hadn't known he had my number. I set the phone in the cup holder face down and drove. When I got home, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and pulled up my email out of habit. There was a message from my attorney, not about anything dramatic, just a contract review I'd asked for. And seeing her name in my inbox made me feel oddly like myself again to bed. Over the next week, my aunt tried to call 4 times. I didn't answer. My uncle left a voicemail that started with, "I know you're upset," and I deleted it before it finished. Vincent texted me twice more, both times variations on the theme of me being dramatic. What I didn't know during that week was that the fallout from the dinner hadn't actually ended when I walked out. According to Angela, who called me on a Wednesday and apologized so sincerely I believed her, the table had spent 40 minutes after I left figuring out how to divide the check. My aunt had refused to pay for the 3rd bottle of wine because she claimed she hadn't ordered it. My uncle's brother had disputed the cocktail charges. Vincent had offered to pay his own portion, and then recalculated it in a way that apparently didn't include his girlfriend's order or the shared appetizers he'd eaten most of. The server had eventually called a manager. The restaurant had split the check by itemized order and the table had paid, but the tip, Angela told me quietly, was less than 10%. I thanked her for telling me. She asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, just the 2 of us. I said yes. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 weeks after the dinner, I got a certified letter. It was from my Aunt Sandra. Not a personal letter, an actual formal letter, on paper with her return address printed at the top, as if she'd had stationery made. The letter informed me that I had caused significant distress and public humiliation to the family by walking out on a celebratory dinner. It said my behavior reflected a pattern of selfishness and ingratitude going back many years. It said I owed my uncle an apology. It said the family had discussed the matter and agreed that until I made amends, I would not be welcome at family gatherings. There was a postscript. She had heard through a mutual acquaintance. She didn't say who, that my company was doing reasonably well. She suggested that in light of this, I might want to make things right by contributing to a fund she was organizing for a family reunion trip to Florida the following summer. The estimated cost was $6,200. I read the letter twice. I folded it and put it in the folder in my file cabinet where I keep documents I might need later. I didn't respond. 2 months passed. I focused on work. We were in the middle of a large contract with a biotech firm based in Boston, and I was spending most of my time in meetings and in the lab, and in conversations with my team about a timeline that was tighter than I would have liked. I traveled to Boston twice. I gave a talk at a conference in San Diego. I hired a new director of operations and spent 2 weeks onboarding her. I was busy in the way that I like to be busy, where the work is hard enough to require full attention. I had mostly stopped thinking about my aunt's letter. Then Angela called again. "You need to know something," she said, and I could tell from her voice that she was somewhere she could be overheard and was trying to keep her register low. "My mom found out how successful your company actually is." I went very still. "How?" I asked. "Vincent," she said. "He went looking. He found your company name, found some press mentions, found the licensing deals. He told my mom. And? She's called a family meeting," Angela said. "She's saying you've been hiding your success from the family on purpose. She's saying you owe them." Her voice dropped lower. "She's using words like inheritance and family assets." I sat with that for a moment. My mother's estate, small but real, a house and some savings and a piece of land in southern Ohio that had been in her family for generations, had been handled by my Uncle Dale as executor when she passed. I was 19 at the time. I was in my first year of college, grieving, trusting that the adults around me were handling things correctly. By the time I knew enough to ask questions, my uncle had told me the estate had cleared, debts settled, a small disbursement to me, the land sold. I had always felt something wrong about it, but I had never looked closely. I was young and sad, and I didn't have the tools. I had the tools now. I called my attorney that same afternoon. I told her what Angela had told me, and I told her about the estate. I told her I wanted to understand what had happened to my mother's land. She started making calls. What she found took 11 days and access to county property records, and one conversation with a title company that had handled a transaction in 2015. The land hadn't been sold. It had been transferred. My Uncle Dale had filed documents 11 months after my mother's death, transferring the ownership of that land to a holding LLC registered in his name. The LLC had then sold the land to a developer for $340,000. I sat in my attorney's office on a Thursday afternoon, and she laid out the documents in front of me on the conference table and walked me through each one. And I remember thinking, very clearly, I knew something was wrong. What my uncle had done was not a gray area. It was fraud. It was the theft of an inheritance from a 19-year-old girl who was too young and too sad to know she should have been watching. My attorney contacted a litigation specialist she knew. I spent 3 weeks providing documentation, answering questions, reviewing records. I was calm throughout, in the way you are calm when you have passed through the anger and come out the other side of it into something colder and cleaner. I also quietly hired a different kind of help, a forensic accountant who specialized in estate matters. She found 2 additional items. A joint account my mother had held with my Aunt Sandra, emptied 6 weeks after my mother's death, and a personal loan my mother had extended to my uncle that had been quietly marked as forgiven in estate documents I had never been shown. It was a great deal of money, not by the standards of what I had now, but it had mattered enormously to the person I was at 19. My attorney filed a civil complaint. The notice was served to my Uncle Dale on a Wednesday morning. Angela told me later that he called my aunt immediately and that the conversation lasted almost 2 hours. By that afternoon, my aunt had called me 6 times. I didn't pick up. The following week, my attorney received a letter from a lawyer representing my uncle and my aunt jointly. The letter proposed mediation. It suggested that the matter was a misunderstanding of estate accounting procedures and expressed hope that the family could resolve things without unnecessary legal entanglement. My attorney wrote back. The mediation session was held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus on a February morning when the temperature outside was 11 degrees. I wore a gray blazer and flat boots, and I sat on one side of the table with my attorney and my forensic accountant and a binder of documents. My uncle came in with his lawyer and didn't look at me for the first 15 minutes. My aunt was not in the room. I don't know if she had been advised not to come or if she had simply decided not to. Either way, she wasn't there. The session was not long. My uncle's attorney made a statement about good faith and accounting complexities and the difficulty of estate administration. My attorney set a document on the table. Then my forensic accountant set another document on the table. My uncle's attorney asked for a break. The break lasted 22 minutes. When they came back, my uncle's attorney said his client was prepared to discuss a settlement. I won't say the number we settled on. It was more than the assessed value of the land in 2015. It included interest. It included the joint account and the loan. My attorney was satisfied. My forensic accountant said it was a fair outcome. I signed the agreement on a Thursday afternoon in March and sat in my car, in the parking garage, for a few minutes afterward, not crying, just very quiet. I called Angela that evening. She had known about the mediation only in broad strokes, and she listened to what I told her with the particular silence of someone processing something they suspected, but hadn't wanted to confirm. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "for all of it, for not paying attention sooner, for being in that family and not seeing it." "You were a kid too," I said. "We both were." We talked for almost an hour. She told me her daughter was starting to walk. I told her about the conference in San Diego and a funny thing that had happened in the hotel lobby. It was the most normal conversation I had had with a member of my family in years. Before we hung up, she asked me what I was going to do now. I thought about it. "The same thing I've been doing," I said. "Work, build, keep going." She laughed a little. "That sounds right." I didn't feel triumphant exactly. Triumph implies that the other side had something I wanted. They didn't. What I had wanted, a family that showed up, a mother who was still alive, a childhood where I hadn't been made to feel like a burden dressed in a flannel shirt, none of that was retrievable. What I had was the settlement. And the house in Bexley. And 8 employees who showed up every day to work on something that mattered. And the letter in my file cabinet, which I took out that evening and looked at one more time, my aunt's note about contributing to the Florida Reunion Fund, before I put it through the shredder. I blocked their numbers the next morning, all of them except Angela. I didn't feel angry when I did it. I didn't feel sad either. It was more like putting down something heavy that I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. I set my phone on my desk. I opened my laptop. I had a meeting in an hour with the Boston team and a formulation review after that. And somewhere in between I needed to return a call from the university about the grant. There was a lot of work to do. There always was. And for the first time in a long time that felt less like an escape, and more like exactly where I was supposed to be.